I went abroad for further studies. When I returned to my country, he and Daria had been married for nearly 2 years, and I had long since let it go. But at the welcome banquet for my return, Zenith, who had once fought against the whole world to be with Arya, looked at the person he had managed to marry only after great efforts with a cold expression and disgusted gaze. In a cold tone, he said, "Didn't I tell you to stay at home? Why are you out here making a fool of yourself?" When I returned to my country, my domestic friends prepared a grand welcome banquet for me. Zenith actually came as well. 7 years ago. For the sake of Arya, he insisted on breaking off our engagement with me, who was from a similar family background, and in front of all the elders. He said, if he couldn't marry Arya, then he would rather marry a dog than me. Such words were so insulting, and he didn't even care about the friendship between our two families over the years. That day, I was finally exhausted. I cried for an hour in front of my parents and begged them to agree to break off the engagement. I said I didn't want Zenith anymore. I didn't want to marry him. My parents looked at me with heartache and finally relented. They personally went to talk to Zenith's parents behind closed doors for an hour. The final result of the talk was, it wasn't that Zenith didn't want me anymore, but that the Mona family didn't want to marry off their daughter. At this point, the engagement was null and void. Although our two families didn't reach the point of a complete break and never seeing each other again, our relationship gradually cooled down. Later, I went to study in Paris. Until today when I return, I look at Zenith. Compared to 7 years ago, he has become much taller and more stable. His handsome face is with noble and aloofness. His dark eyes are fixedly looking at me. No one told me that Zenith would come. I turned to look at my childhood friend Sonia, who is hosting today. Sonia quickly distanced herself and explained, "It's not me who invited him. Mona somehow heard the news of your return and volunteered to say that he would arrange a welcome banquet for you instead of me." After saying that, she added guiltily, and tried to cover it up by saying, "It's none of my business. I didn't say anything." Instead, Zenith laughed. His tone was gentle, just like when he used to pick me up and take me to school at my house before we had a fallout. "Mona, so many years have passed. I was young and impulsive before and hurt you. So today, I have the audacity to host this banquet and want to apologize to you." After a pause, he looked into my eyes and continued, "Are you still holding a grudge about the past?" Looking at these words, if I said I was still holding a grudge, it would seem that I was too petty and couldn't let go of him. So I looked up and gave him a brilliant smile. "As you said, it's all in the past. After all, we are all in the same social circle. And indeed so much time has passed. He is insignificant to me now. So burying the hatchet with a smile is at least like this on the surface." I picked up the wine beside me and smiled casually. "I heard from Sonia that you and Daria got married more than a year ago. Haven't congratulated you yet. This toast is for you." His expression was indifferent. Logically speaking, having married the girl he has been longing for, even if he has a cold personality, he shouldn't be so indifferent. Before I had time to wonder, he picked up the wine beside him and drank it. It didn't seem like he was being blessed. Instead, it was like drinking to drown his sorrows. But I was too lazy to care anymore. Old friends and childhood friends meet. Naturally, there is constant small talk. I am the protagonist today. Everyone is also boost S prestige. The topics are all centered around me. Someone asked me how many boyfriends I had had in France. Someone mentioned my art exhibition on a global tour. There was also someone who seemed to be half joking and half complaining. "Really? Mona, why are you so excellent? Tickets to your art exhibitions are hard to get. You have opened so many galleries around the world. My old man is always disappointed in me and asks me to learn from you. Don't just be chasing stars. Shopping for bags and sports cars all day." I laughed. "Just a hobby." Zenith, who had been silent all along, laughed. "After all these years, you have learned to be modest." His tone. How should I put it? His tone was natural, like an old friend. With intimacy. As if before we had a fallout. He hadn't said those hurtful words and done those hurtful things to me in a cold and disgusted tone for the sake of Arya. I didn't know how to respond. I don't know if it was my illusion. I felt that his tone seemed a bit ambiguous. When I was still pondering how to respond to him, he had already added another sentence. I went to see your dream of samsara. It's great. Now not only me but also the friends around me sensed something was wrong. They fell silent and their gazes subtly shifted between me and Zenith. I remained calm and said politely, "Oh, thank you." After a pause, I jokingly reminded him, "Did you go with Arya? By the way, why didn't she come today? I haven't seen her for many years either. After all, we are all old classmates." His expression became indifferent again. His tone was casual. "Oh, she has something to do at home." This tone was like talking about an irrelevant person. I don't know why he mentioned the person he once loved so desperately with such a tone and attitude. But I don't want to get involved. So I laughed twice and changed the topic. Until the end of the gathering, we saw Arya sitting on the sofa in the hall at the entrance of the club. Her eyes were fixed on the direction of the private VIP elevator. Her expression was tense, anxious and uneasy. As soon as the elevator door opened, she suddenly stood up from the sofa. It seemed that she had been sitting here waiting for us to come out. Everyone was stunned. She forced a smile and looked around, until her gaze fell on me beside Zenith. Her face instantly turned pale. She stared at me in a daze, looking lost and dejected, as if facing a formidable enemy. I was baffled. Arya has changed a lot. I remember the first time I saw her was when she transferred to our class in the second semester of her senior year in high school. At that time, she was wearing the school uniform and standing on the podium. She was so thin that she seemed malnourished. The clothes hung loosely on her body. Her facial features were ordinary and plain. There was a look of nervousness and uneasiness on her face. The head teacher was very happy and said, "This is Arya, who is always ranked high in the provincial joint entrance examinations." Everyone, welcome. Countless inquisitive gazes fell on Arya in silence. We attend a private aristocratic high school where everyone is either wealthy or of noble status. Academic achievements are not the only factor for acceptance. Not to mention Arya's unimpressive appearance. At that time, I felt a bit sorry for her. So I smiled and was the first to start applauding. Only then did scattered applause ring out in the class. Until it filled every corner of the classroom, the head teacher smiled gratefully at me and pointed at me, saying to Arya, "This is the class monitor, Mona. If you have any problems, you can ask her for help." Although those words were said, Arya never asked me for help. Because she had Zenith protecting her. Zenith, who was my boyfriend at that time. When Arya transferred to our class, there was no extra seat except beside Zenith. So Arya became Zenith's desk mate. I don't know if their later betrayal of my feelings started to germinate from here. For example, Arya's family is poor. She has severe hypoglycemia and anemia. Once during morning self-study, she suddenly fainted. It was Zenith who carried her to the infirmary. For example, when Zenith's mother returned from Belgium and bought many gifts for me and Zenith. When she asked me to pick first, Zenith, who was standing aside, took out a box of handmade chocolates and said, "I want this box of candies." At that time, I was still puzzled because Zenith didn't like anything sweet. And I had never seen him have a special preference for chocolates at any time. Later, he also asked me for the pastry recipe of my family's chef. I found it troublesome and asked my family's chef to make it and send it to him directly. At that time, I still thought Zenith had changed his taste. It wasn't until later that I saw the candy wrapper on Arya's desk, as well as the pastries made by my family's chef that I gave to Zenith. It's Arya who loves chocolates. It's also Arya who likes pastries and sweets. I convinced myself that this was just some way for Zenith to care for his peer desk mate. Although Zenith is not a kind person who loves to meddle and save others. In fact, it's not that I didn't have doubts. It's just that Arya is really too ordinary. I never thought that Zenith would betray me and fall in love with Arya. After all, I am so excellent. I am the most beautiful person in the whole school. During the most popular period of Beyond the Realm of Conscience, some people affectionately gave me a nickname called Monas and How. Of course, it's not because my temperament and character are like Laosam Ho. It's just because I have a good family background, good grades, and good popularity. How could I have thought that Zenith would betray me and fall in love with Arya? But now, 7 years have passed. Arya is no longer as thin and shabby as she was back then. She is all dressed in high-end clothes and carrying high-end bags. The big logos on her body are expensive but somewhat tacky and don't seem to suit her well. She came over and smiled at me, making small talk. "Mona, you're back?" After she finished speaking, her gaze hesitantly shifted between me and Zenith. The inquisitive meaning in this gaze is uncomfortable. I frowned slightly, feeling a bit displeased. Zenith was the first to speak, his tone cold. "Why are you here?" Arya carefully looked at Zenith's expression. For some reason, her smile had a pitifully ingratiating look. "I was shopping. The boss of the club said that you and your friends are here today to give Mona a welcome party. So I waited for you to go back together." This excuse is really full of flaws. She also held up the bag in her hand for Zenith to see. When the manager here heard that I was here, he specially sent 2 bottles of red wine, saying it's to show respect to Mrs. Zenith and President Zenith. She emphasized the words Mrs. Zenith, as if declaring some kind of sovereignty. Hearing this, Zenith, who had been looking indifferent before, frowned unpleasantly. I heard a friend behind me couldn't help but let out a suppressed chuckle. With Enith's family status, not to mention the club manager, even the boss has to make an appointment half a month in advance to see Zenith. She is Zenith's wife, holding 2 bottles of wine given by a manager as if they were treasures and presenting them to Zenith like showing off a treasure. This is really unimpressive and beneath one's dignity. Obviously, such embarrassing things should have happened many times in the more than 1 year since Arya married Zenith. Because Zenith's voice was very impatient, and not at all polite. "Didn't I tell you to stay at home? Why do you come out and make a fool of yourself?" A friend behind laughed out loud. Arya's already pale face suddenly turned deathly pale. She looked at Zenith helplessly. She didn't know why Zenith suddenly got angry, or where she had gone wrong. No one explained the reason to her, and no one taught her what to do. Everyone was laughing at her lack of knowledge and unimpressive appearance. I was a bit surprised by Zenith's attitude. Subconsciously, I turned my head to look at him. His face was cold and indifferent in the suppressed laughter of everyone, as if the person being laughed at wasn't the one he had painstakingly married. I was stunned for a moment. He wasn't like this before. At that time, Arya had experienced some collective isolation in the class because she didn't fit in. Later, Zenith wanted to break off our engagement because of her. I also bullied Arya. But every time, Zenith would stand in front of Arya and defend her and protect her. But now he stands here, looking down at Arya standing in front of him, his expression cold, with a barely perceptible trace of weariness and impatience in his eyes. He is really a different person from back then. How can he despise Arya? Has he forgotten how he treated me back then in order to defend Arya? The first time Zenith stood up for Arya was in an English class. For us, among all subjects, the one we are most at ease with is probably English. Since we were 2 years old, there will be several resident English foreign teachers in our family. We communicate in English all the time, from grammar to pronunciation. They are as standard as British aristocrats. This is one of our essential basic skills. That day, the English teacher called on Arya and asked her to read a text. When she uttered the first sound as she stood up, there was commotion below, until she read halfway. Finally someone couldn't help but let out a faft and laugh. It cannot be denied that her grades are very good, but probably because she hasn't received systematic education. Her pronunciation is awkward, with an embarrassing embarrassment. This laughter seemed contagious and gradually became noisy until Arya stood there without making any sound. The English teacher was also a bit helpless and asked her to sit down, then tried hard to change the topic. After class, Sonia deliberately walked to Arya's side and loudly imitated her pronunciation to communicate with her companions in English. She imitated it vividly, and the people beside her couldn't help but laugh. Arya sat at her seat with her head down, and the broken hair on her forehead hung down. Looking from the side, I couldn't see her expression, but her profile was thin, and only her shoulders carried a restrained emotion. I don't know why, but suddenly I felt a bit disinterested. I wanted to call out to Sonia and tell her not to bully the new classmate. But before I could open my mouth, Zenith, who had always disliked meddling in other people's business, took action first. He was originally lying on his seat sleeping. Hearing Sonia's ridicule, he got up expressionlessly and then casually picked up the Harry Potter in front of him. He knocked on the table with the thick cover of the book. The thumping sound was very obvious. Amidst this sound, he coldly looked at Sonia, who was laughing at Arya, and coldly said, "Shut up. It's so noisy." Sonia's smile froze on her face. The classroom was deadly silent. My gaze fell on Zenith. After a pause, I looked at Sonia and smiled gently, breaking the awkward silence. I said, "Sonia, class is about to start." Sonia turned around and made a choosing gesture at me, nodding along as she took the steps. She pulled her companion and returned to her seat, obediently saying, "I know." I glanced at Arya out of the corner of my eye. She tilted her head and looked at Zenith with bright eyes and was quietly talking to him. I think she was probably thanking him. But Zenith had a nonchalant expression and no emotional reaction. Later, after having lunch, I met Arya in the library again. At noon, the library is the least crowded time because most people are eating, sleeping, or chatting about the latest gossip. She was sitting in a hidden corner by the window. I heard her laboriously practicing her accent with a small player. I didn't think much of it, and was about to take a nap on the other side, until I saw Zenith. He was still as handsome as ever and looked unconcerned. He walked in with his English original version of Harry Potter, and didn't stop until he reached Arya. He stood next to Arya, and said, "Practicing like this is useless for you." As he spoke, he sat down beside Arya casually, opened the Harry Potter in his hand, and pointed to a sentence and said, "Read this sentence for me." With Zenith's encouragement, Arya blushed, and after holding back for a long time, she slowly and intermittently read out a little bit. My Tei been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall outside was showing no sign of sleepiness. Zenith's fingertip was on drifting. I heard him patiently teaching Arya how to pronounce a beautiful British accent. The library was so quiet. The sunlight shone in through the huge window. One could see tiny gold and dust dancing in the air, and those two gentle men and women bathed in the sunlight were like a painting. Of course, up to this point, it had nothing to do with Arya. She was just passively accepting Zenith's help. Until finally, I saw her staring at Zenith's face and blushing little by little. Then she said enviously in a low voice to Zenith, "I really envy Mona." What she envied was self-evident. From that moment on, I began to dislike Arya. For of course, no one could tell that I didn't like Arya. I have always been easygoing and indifferent. Although the classmates in the class follow my lead, I never engage in forming cliques or isolating people. At first, I targeted her in physical education class. Boys and girls practiced tennis separately, and everyone chose their own partner. As expected, Arya was left over. She stood awkwardly in the middle of the court with a racket in her hand, looking around with a flushed face. Looking helpless, pitiful, and weak. I smiled, walked over, and extended my hand to her, saying, "Let's be a team." She was somewhat flattered and looked at me in surprise. Stammering, Me? I nodded and smiled and said, "Yes. You." She smiled at me, looking very grateful. Thinking of the scene between her and Zenith in the library, I wiped off the smile on my face completely in an instant as I turned around. I thought expressionlessly, hoping she could still smile later. Arya didn't catch any of my balls. Like walking a dog. Every time I served the ball, I would hit it to a place where Arya couldn't reach. She was in a panic and tried her best, running around and reaching everywhere, but could only keep picking up the ball. While picking up the ball, she also apologized to me. I'm sorry. I'm really too bad. She didn't realize that I was deliberately making things difficult for her. Until later, there were gradually classmates gathering around us. I heard a classmate behind me whisper, "What's wrong with school beauty Mona? I've never seen her treat a person like this. When did the new student offend school beauty Mona?" I smiled as if I hadn't heard anything. I served the ball in a tricky way until Arias tumbled and fell to the ground while trying to catch one of my balls. I stood smiling in place and apologized to her without any apology. "Oh, I'm really sorry." She lowered her head, covering her swollen and red knee, and said in a low voice, It's okay." I smiled very kindly and continued, "Your tennis skills are really too bad. In the group match later, you mustn't hold me back." Arya apologized while struggling to stand up in a messy way. People around were watching the excitement. Until Zenith came over. He looked at me and then took the racket from Arya's tearful hand and looked at me coldly. He smiled and said, "She has poor tennis skills. Mona, I'll practice with you." I was badly beaten by Zenith. For fairness, he still used his left hand. When he was 12 years old, he won the championship in the youth tennis competition. I just practiced for 2 or 3 years back then to have a common topic with him. My amateur level is really nothing in front of him. I forced myself to play with him for half an hour and caught very few balls. But fortunately, I didn't need to pick up the balls. Every ball that I couldn't catch would be picked up by a boy who had a crush on me and handed to me. I just stubbornly looked at Zenith. He didn't show any mercy at all. Until the last ball. When he served, the tennis ball grazed the net and hit my knee hard at the exact same position as the injured leg of Arya. I couldn't bear the pain. If someone hadn't exclaimed and supported me, I would have directly knelt on the ground in pain. Zenith was indifferent and looked at me coldly and coldly said, "Mona, with your skill, even if no one holds you back, you still can't win." After he finished speaking, he looked back at Arya and waved at her, saying, "Come here. Let's go." Arya looked at him like Shirchia looking at the supreme treasure descending from the sky. She nodded obediently and said, "Okay." Later, several classmates sent me to the infirmary. After applying the medicine, Sonia accompanied me. Sonia has always been careless. But that day she also sensed something was wrong. She asked me, "Mona, is Zenith crazy?" What was said came true. Later, the things he did were indeed crazy. For early access, go to 8 bus. But now, how ridiculous. He actually regrets it. It's really hilarious. Several days after the welcome banquet, Sonia dared to call me. She asked cautiously, "Mona, are you angry?" While adjusting pigments, I said casually, "Angry about what?" She didn't speak. After a while, she sighed and said, "Well, Mona, let me ask you secretly. Do you still like Zenith?" Hearing this, I was so shocked that I almost fell off the chair. After steadying myself, I asked Sonia not know whether to laugh or cry. "What made you have such a misunderstanding? Tell me quickly so I can correct it." She hesitated for a while. "Because I think Zenith, he seems to regret marrying Arya. And let me tell you, before you return to the country, Chalmith asked about you several times. She told me some gossip that I had missed. After I went abroad for further study in a fit of anger due to heartbreak. Although the alliance between me and Zenith was broken, Zenith's mother firmly disagreed with his relationship with Arya. Zenith probably truly loved Arya. For her sake, he stayed in the country to accompany Arya to college. After graduation, he left the Zenith family and didn't spend a penny from his family. He started his own business. Honestly, although everyone was indignant for you during that time, we were quite touched by Zenith's grand gestures for Arya. After all, it's true love. Later, the Zenith family couldn't oppose Zenith. After all, he is the only son. After a year of stalemate, they compromised and agreed to Zenith marrying Arya. As a result, on the wedding day, the Zenith family lost all face. Although Arya came from a slum, her family was quite large. Plus, Arya's parents intended to show off. All of Arya's distant relatives and neighbors heard that the daughter of the Arya family had climbed a high branch. They came to the wedding banquet in droves to drink wedding wine. At that time, probably to maintain Arya's face in front of his own family, Shanith didn't separate the tables at the wedding banquet. The relatives of the Zenith family, business partners, and the relatives of the Arya family were all in one banquet hall. As a result, one can imagine, a noisy group of people were shouting loudly. Children were running and shouting everywhere. And Arya's parents were loudly boasting about their daughter's great ability and making the eldest son of the Zenith family obedient. It is said that one of Arya's uncles, in order to act superior, even asked Zenith to kneel down and kowed out to him when toasting. A person like Zenith, who is surrounded by stars and held in high esteem, probably has only knelt in the ancestral hall of the Zenith family. That night, Shamith's mother was so angry that she was hospitalized. This was the beginning of his and Arya's wedding. Later, Arya's family often swaggered and cheated under Zenith's name. Shanith has dealt with many thorny matters. Arya's brother's drunk driving and killing someone, uncle's house purchase, aunt's child's schooling, disabled father's job. Big and small matters piled up. Up to now, the little affections Zenith had for Arya has been completely exhausted. I listened infuriately. For some reason, I suddenly thought of Zenith standing in front of me back then and explaining to me why he fell in love with Arya. He said to me coldly word by word, "Mona, you are a wealthy young lady who has had a smooth life and gotten everything she wants since birth. But Arya has nothing but has taken root in the soil and grown a dazzling light of her audacious growth. I really like Arya. I like her exuberant vitality and unyielding soul." His words from back then are still vivid in my mind. But the admiration and liking from back then are almost gone. Why? Is it that Arya's vitality is no longer exuberant or that her unyielding soul no longer dazzles him? Extremely ridiculous. I casually interrupted Sonia, my tone a bit cold. I don't care what happens between him and Daria. His affairs have nothing to do with me. I don't want to hear about it, and I'm not interested. Sonia, if you mention him in front of me again, our friendship is over. Okay. Sonia hurriedly apologized. I'll never mention it again. I just want what's best for you. After all, you back then. She held back the rest of her words. But I know what she wants to say. After all, I liked Zenith so much back then. But the past is like the wind. Who will only love one person in their lifetime? Especially someone who has hurt themselves. I am still willing to say a few words to Zenith now only because I am a magnanimous and decent person. And for me, he is insignificant. If possible, I actually don't want to have any intersection with Zenith and Arya. But it seems that only I think this way. Those two don't think so. 6. I ran into Zenith at a business cocktail party. In the same circle. It's hard to avoid seeing each other. When I felt stuffy and was taking a break on the terrace, Shamith came over with a glass of red wine and stood beside me, chatting with me in a low voice. I dealt with him absentedly. Until finally, he turned his face sideways and looked into the distance at the layered scenery, looking extremely disappointed and lonely. After hesitating for a long time, he asked me guiltily in a hesitant tone, "Mona, have you been well abroad these years?" I turned my head and looked at him with a half smile, reminding him, "Zenith, you are married." In such moonlight and atmosphere. Do you think it's reasonable for you to start such a topic with your ex-fiancé? My tone was not polite. But he laughed instead. Looking unconcerned. Just a chat between old friends. You are too sensitive, Mona. I subtly sarcasticized. Sorry. But after all, you have a past record, right? He paused. There was no anger on his face. Instead, he gave a wry smile. He sighed and looked at the scenery in the distance again. He said, I'm just too tired. Everyone knows why he is tired. The wife Zenith married has almost become a joke in the entire circle. Jokes about the Zenith family are not common. I didn't pick up his words but gracefully picked up my own glass beside me and was about to leave. Before leaving, I gave him a polite smile and said, but this is someone you carefully chose. The next time we met was at Zenith's mother's birthday banquet. Since I returned to the country, Shumith's mother has often called me. Over the years, although the relationship between our family and the Zenith family has gradually cooled down, we still have some business dealings. Moreover, Shumith's mother used to love me very much. I can satirize Zenith who betrayed me, but I can't not give Zenith's mother face. She called me personally. Mona, Aunt's birthday is next Wednesday. Do you have time to come? You child. You left for 7 years and didn't even make a single phone call, when invited by an elder personally. As a junior, it's naturally not good to refuse. After hanging up the phone, I went to pick out a suitable gift. Only when I arrived at the Zenith family did I feel something was wrong. Zenith's mother's birthday banquet was not held on a large scale, and there were no outsiders. It was just some relatives of the Zenith family. So my appearance is a bit strange. I was stunned for a moment. But when Zenith's mother saw me, she was very happy. Sitting beside her were female relatives of Zenith's family of the same age. Shumith's aunt by marriage. They were all very familiar elders. Zenith's mother waved and called me over and asked me to sit beside her. I paused. I didn't want to embarrass anyone on this occasion. So I kept smiling, walked over, and sat beside Zenith's mother. I didn't see Arya. Zenith's mother held my hand and looked at me carefully. For some reason, her eyes became moist. She said with emotion, this child has grown up under my eyes. Now she is becoming more and more beautiful and excellent. The people around echoed Zenith's mother's words and praised me as they looked at me, listening to the praises of those around her. Zenith's mother smiled again, with a nostalgic tone. She said, the first time I saw this child was when she was 5 years old. Her parents took her and moved next door to my house. Wearing a pink puff skirt, she was sweetly smiling as her mother laid her over to give a neighbor's greeting gift. At that time, I thought, why didn't I have a daughter? On this occasion, I don't need to say anything. I just need to keep silent and smile at the right time. Zenith and Daria came back when it was time to eat. Zenith probably knew I was there and wasn't too surprised to see me. He even nodded at me. But Arya beside him turned pale again and was in a daze when she saw me. She forced a smile and greeted Zenith's mother. Mom, happy birthday. Zenith's mother glanced up at her as if she hadn't heard. Her face was as cold as ice and she didn't respond at all. She just held my hand and led me towards the dining room, saying, good child. Come and sit with Auntie. At this point, even if I were stupid, I could see that something was wrong. This awkwardness reached its peak during the meal because in front of me were all the dishes I used to love very much. Zenith's mother introduced them while feeling sorry for me. You child. You must have suffered a lot outside. You look so thin. Try this clear soup with bird's nest. It's your favorite when you were little. Every time Zenith made you angry, you would be fine as soon as he used this dish to coax you. Aunt One in the kitchen knew it was for you. She started soaking the bird's nest 4 or 5 days in advance. Come and taste if it's the same as before. Bang. Amidst Zenith's mother's words, a commotion came from across. I looked up and didn't know if it was because of being absenced Minton Churtis. Arya knocked over her plate. There were servants nearby who wanted to come forward to clean up. But I don't know what Arya was thinking. She awkwardly refused the servants nearby, and took out a tissue to squat on the ground to clean up. There were still some panicked apologies in her mouth. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. When Arya was about to squat under the table in front of everyone, Chinith reached out and pulled her. He looked at Arya coldly and said, "That's enough. Look at yourself." He turned his head and ordered the servant beside him, "Sister Ling, come and clean up." Zenith's mother was probably extremely angry and was breathing rapidly. I heard her voice. So embarrassing. So embarrassing. Fortunately, it's all family. As long as the door is closed, it's fine. She turned her head to look at me and asked, "Mona, look. Look." She was probably really furious. In front of Arya, without any disguise at all, she said bluntly and unceremoniously, "If Zenith had married you back then, there wouldn't be all these things." She covered her heart, probably because she was so angry that her heart ached. Holding my hand, she spoke without thinking, "Mona, Mona, I remember you used to like Zenith very much. This stupid boy was confused and hurt you. But the past is like the wind. Can you forgive him? For Auntie's sake. Can you forgive him this time?" The entire restaurant was so silent that a pin drop could be heard. Everyone's eyes were on me. Even Zenith's gaze was on me. For what his mother said in front of his wife. He didn't react at all. He just looked at me quietly with his eyes, as if waiting for my answer. Arya covered her mouth and ran out crying. But no one cared about her. I slowly put down my chopsticks on the table. First, I smiled and said to Zenith's mother, "Zami's mother, I'm very happy that you didn't have a big celebration for your birthday but invited me over. When I was little, you were the one who loved me the most. Even after Zenith betrayed me, I have never forgotten all the kindness you showed me. Today is your birthday. As a junior, I should have made you happy. But this question you asked me is really difficult to answer." I paused, smiled gracefully and responded to everyone's gazes. Finally, I said, "Zenith's mother, I'm sorry. This time when I returned to the country, I was planning to introduce my boyfriend to my family. I'm going to be engaged. You watched me grow up. No matter what, the past is like the wind. I hope you can be there to witness my happiness." The whole place was silent. Zenith's mother looked at me in surprise. After a long time, she asked, How come there's no news at all?" She paused for a long time before asking, "Which family's young master is so lucky?" I lowered my eyes. "The eldest son of the family. Ethan." I heard the sound of gasping. Zenith's mother was silent for a long time. It was Zenith's aunt, who came out to smooth things over. She smiled and said, "Then it's a perfect match made in heaven. Mona is a lucky one." I just smiled without saying a word. Shanith looked at me. There was no emotion on his face. Only his eyes were complicated. After a while, he smiled at me and said self-deprecatingly, "Congratulations." I nodded gracefully at him and also smiled. "Thank you." 7 things related to Zenith's family come to an end here. Later, Zenith's mother finally stopped calling me. I heard that she went to the hospital to stay for a while again. The last time I met Arya was in my gallery. I was chatting casually with Sonia at that time. My assistant came in and said that someone wanted to buy my painting at a high price but wanted to talk to me. When I went out, I saw Arya standing in front of one of my paintings. Hearing the footsteps, she turned her head and looked at me. Strangely, my impression of her has always been timid, awkward, not knowing where to put her hands and feet. But when there were only the two of us, her timidity and nervousness seemed to disappear. There was only a certain kind of gnashing hatred for me. She looked at me and asked, "Mona, are you watching my joke? Right?" I laughed. Honestly, I have a lot of things to do and many people to meet every day. I don't have time to focus on someone I don't care about at all. I said calmly. You're overthinking. She looked at me. For some reason. She covered her face and burst into tears again. Do you know? Zenith is going to divorce me. I heard him call his divorce lawyer. He doesn't want me anymore. I don't know why. Clearly you are already going to be engaged. Why does he want to divorce me? What did I do wrong? I just made a mistake in my background. I don't have a family and education like yours. You are all watching my joke and think I'm not good enough. But can this be blamed on me? I also want to be like you. I want to have a prominent family background and be liked by everyone. But I don't have a family like yours. You are just born better than me. If we were on the same starting line, I wouldn't be so humiliating. If you were me, you wouldn't have come to this point today. In the final analysis, you still rely on your family. She was crying very sadly. Fortunately, there was no one else in the gallery at the moment. I didn't want to pay attention to her, but she obviously had an attitude that she wouldn't leave until she finished crying. I think these words and grievances must have been pent up in her for a long time, and she wanted to find a place to pour them out. Even if the object is me. I thought of her obsequious, ingratiating and pleasing everyone in the Zenith family. I sighed and said, Arya, you are wrong. If I were you, I wouldn't have come to where you are today. First, I remember your grades were very good back then. If I were you, I wouldn't stay in the Zenith family after graduating from university and rely on the Zenith family to support me. I would use the connections and funds of the Zenith family to start my own business. Second, you said your family is poor and you don't have the same education as me. If I were you, after marrying into the Zenith family, I would learn social etiquette, communication manners, and dressing aesthetics. See more, listen more and speak less. But unfortunately, it has been almost 2 years since you married into the Zenith family. Compared to 7 years ago, I haven't seen any progress in you. Third, I wouldn't tolerate a large family of relatives openly living off others without learning any skills. Your relatives are your backing. Your entire family is like parasites relying on the Zenith family. How can you expect the people of the Zenith family to respect you? Saying these words is meddling in other people's business. Why did I remind Arya? I can't even tell myself. Probably it's because of Arya, who was nervous and uneasy on the podium back then. She tried so hard to integrate into a new environment and tried so hard to find a way out through learning and relying on herself. Later it turned out like this. I don't know what to say. Arya put down her hand covering her face. The tear stains on her face were clearly visible. She sobbed. But just like a drowning person seeing a life beway, her eyes gradually lit up in my words. She said, Then if I do as you say now, is there still hope? She is really hopeless. All her hopes in the Zenith family depend on Zenith's love. Now even Zenith is about to give up on her. It's too late for her to do what she should have done 2 years ago. I looked at her pitifully. Consider it as doing a good deed to accumulate virtue for myself and reminded her. You said Zenith has already contacted a divorce lawyer. Arya, if I were you, I would take the initiative to propose divorce to Zenith at this time. You and Zenith have a prenuptial agreement. Maybe the Zenith family will feel guilty when they see you're knowing when to advance and retreat, and will give you a little more compensation instead. She shook her head, crying and laughing at the same time, looking at me. No, Mona. There is still hope for me and Zenith. There is still hope. After she finished speaking, she turned around in a trance and left in a hurry, probably to make the final remedy. Sonia came out from behind me and said, I thought you hated her. I turned around and smiled at Sonia. I never regarded her as an opponent. I just feel sorry for her life. She regarded Zenith as her biggest bargaining chip to change her destiny. She seized this opportunity and also married him. But she forgot that her biggest bargaining chip should be continuous and unremitting efforts to invest in herself. Continuous choices shape life. What is human destiny? It is the result presented by the continuous choices you made at the beginning. Arya attributes everything she is suffering now to her family. She is wrong. She has come to where she is today because she has made the wrong choice at every step of her life. Later, I heard that the divorce of the Zenith family lasted for a long time because Arya was reluctant to divorce. A noisy quarrel made them lose face completely. The whole circle watched the joke several times. Later, the voices gradually died down, and outsiders don't know how it was resolved. A year later, when I got engaged, the Zenith family also came. I saw Zenith's fiancée by his side. She was the daughter of a familiar boss who runs a chain cake brand. The two of them stand together and are well matched. Everyone congratulated Zenith cheerfully. Everyone stood together and had common topics. No one was so rash as to make a fool of themselves and be laughed at. No one mentioned Daria, who was ridiculed after marrying into the upper class. This person disappeared completely from our entire circle, as if she had never existed. Everything was elegant and proper. When I was holding champagne and watching everyone dance in the garden, my fiancé came over and put his hand on my shoulder and asked affectionately, "What are you thinking?" I smiled. Nothing. 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 Nothing.